In a world where strength is measured by muscle and respect is earned through fear, Sarah Mitchell walked into the naval training facility knowing she would face battles far beyond any battlefield. What her fellow trainees didn't know was that the quiet woman they mocked in the locker rooms had already survived what most of them never could. This is the story of how prejudice, determination, and an unexpected revelation changed everything for everyone involved. Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one nobody sees coming. The steam from the communal showers created a thick fog that seemed to mirror the tension hanging in the air. Sarah Mitchell stood under the lukewarm spray, her eyes closed, trying to block out the whispers and snickers echoing off the tiled walls around her. At 5 feet 4 inches and weighing barely 130 pounds, she looked nothing like what most people expected from someone pursuing elite military training. "Look at her," came a voice from behind her, loud enough to be heard over the running water, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. "What does she think she's doing here?" Sarah kept her eyes shut and continued washing her hair, the familiar sting of ridicule washing over her like cold water. She had heard variations of this conversation hundreds of times before in different places, different situations, but always with the same underlying message. She didn't belong. Marcus Rodriguez, a towering 6'3" former college football player, stood with his arms crossed, water dripping from his muscular frame. He had arrived at the naval training facility with the confidence of someone who had never been told he couldn't do something. His voice carried easily through the shower area as he continued his commentary. "I mean, seriously, what's she trying to prove? This isn't some kind of diversity program. People's lives depend on the person next to them." His friend Jake Thompson nodded in agreement, his thick Boston accent adding weight to his words. "My brother went through SEAL training 5 years ago. Said it was the hardest thing he'd ever done, and he was a Marine before that. No way she makes it past the first week." Sarah turned off her shower and reached for her towel, moving with deliberate calm. She had learned long ago that reacting to comments like these only made things worse. Instead, she focused on the routine of getting dressed, organizing her gear, and preparing for whatever challenges the instructors would throw at them next. The truth was, Sarah had heard worse. Much worse. Growing up as the youngest of 4 children in a military family, she had been surrounded by strength and expectations her entire life. Her father, Colonel James Mitchell, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan. Her oldest brother David was a decorated Army Ranger. Her twin brothers, Mark and Luke, had both followed their father into the Army, choosing different specialties but both earning respect in their respective fields. Sarah had always been the outlier. While her brothers were throwing footballs and lifting weights, she was reading military strategy books and studying the tactics that had shaped modern warfare. While they were getting into fights to prove their toughness, she was quietly learning how to end conflicts before they began. Her family loved her, but they had never quite known what to make of her. The locker room gradually emptied as the recruits finished their showers and headed to the mess hall for dinner. Sarah took her time, knowing that entering the dining area with the others would only invite more scrutiny. She preferred to eat alone anyway, using the time to review her notes from the day's training sessions. As she finally made her way through the facility's corridors, Sarah passed by the instructor's offices. The door to Chief Petty Officer Williams' office was slightly ajar, and she could hear voices inside discussing the current group of recruits. "The dropout rate this cycle is going to be higher than usual," came Chief Williams' gravelly voice. "We've got some big personalities in this group, and not all of them are going to mesh well with the reality of what we're asking them to do." "What about the Mitchell recruit?" asked another voice, one Sarah recognized as belonging to Lieutenant Commander Harrison. The file says she's got an interesting background, but the other recruits seem to think she's a weak link. Sarah slowed her pace, not quite stopping, but moving quietly enough to hear Chief Williams' response. "That one's different," he said, and Sarah could hear papers shuffling. "I've been doing this for 15 years, and I can usually tell within the first few days who's going to make it, and who isn't. The big guys, the obvious athletes, they sometimes surprise you by washing out when things get really tough. It's not always about physical strength. You think she has what it takes?" There was a long pause before Chief Williams answered. "I think there's more to her than meets the eye. Her PT scores are actually in the top 10%, despite what her appearance might suggest. And her tactical assessments are some of the best I've seen from a new recruit." Sarah felt a small surge of satisfaction at hearing this. But she also knew that the instructor's opinions wouldn't matter if she couldn't find a way to work with her fellow recruits. Military operations required trust and teamwork, and right now she was clearly on the outside of both. She continued to the mess hall, where she found most of the other recruits clustered around a few tables, their conversations animated as they discussed the day's training exercises. Sarah collected her meal and found an empty table near the window, where she could observe without being the center of attention. The evening's conversation centered around the next day's scheduled exercises, which would include team-based problem-solving scenarios. Sarah knew these would be crucial for establishing dynamics within the group, and she was already mentally preparing for the likelihood that she would be chosen last or relegated to a support role. Marcus Rodriguez stood up from his table and walked over to where Sarah was sitting. His expression was serious rather than mocking, which surprised her. "Look," he said, sitting down across from her without being invited. "I don't know what your story is or why you think you can handle this training, but tomorrow we're going to be working in teams. I don't want my performance dragged down because you can't keep up." Sarah looked up from her meal, meeting his eyes directly. "I understand your concern," she said quietly, "but I think you'll find that I can hold my own." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Hold your own? Do you have any idea what we're going to be facing over the next few months? This isn't about being politically correct or giving everyone a chance. This is about preparing for real combat situations where weakness gets people killed." "I'm aware of what's at stake," Sarah replied, her voice remaining calm despite the growing attention from nearby tables. "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't prepared for it." Jake Thompson had wandered over during their conversation, and he now leaned against the table with his arms crossed. "No offense, but prepared how? What's your background? Because most of us here have either military experience or serious athletic achievements. What makes you think you can compete with that?" Sarah set down her fork and looked at both men. She had faced this question many times before, and she had learned that giving too much information often backfired. People either didn't believe her, or they assumed she was exaggerating to compensate for her appearance. "I've been preparing for this my entire life," she said simply. "Tomorrow you'll see what that means." Marcus shook his head and stood up. "Confidence is good, but delusion is dangerous. Just try not to get anyone hurt with your pride." After he walked away, Sarah finished her meal in silence. She was used to being underestimated, and in many ways, she preferred it. When people had low expectations, it was much easier to surprise them. The challenge was surviving long enough to get that opportunity. Later that evening, as the recruits settled into their bunks, Sarah lay awake listening to the continued conversations about the next day's challenges. Some of the men were placing informal bets on who would perform best in the team exercises, and unsurprisingly, her name was not mentioned as a contender. She thought about her family and the phone call she had made to her father the week before leaving for training. Colonel Mitchell had been supportive, but concerned, knowing better than anyone what she would be facing. "The military has changed a lot since I started," he had told her. "There are more opportunities for women now, but that also means more scrutiny. You're going to have to prove yourself twice as hard as everyone else, and even then, some people will never accept you." "I know, Dad," she had replied, "but this is what I want to do. This is who I am." "I believe you," he had said, "and I'm proud of you for trying. Just remember that strength comes in many forms, and sometimes the most important battles are the ones nobody else can see." As Sarah finally drifted off to sleep, she focused on those words. Tomorrow would be her first real opportunity to show what she was capable of, and she intended to make the most of it. The ridicule and doubt would either fuel her determination or break her spirit, and she had already decided which outcome she would accept. The barracks fell quiet except for the sounds of deep breathing and the occasional snore. Outside, the night shift guards made their rounds, and the facility settled into the rhythm of military discipline that would define the next several months of training. Sarah's dreams were filled with images of obstacles to overcome, tests to pass, and challenges that would push her to her absolute limits. But underneath it all was a quiet confidence that came from knowing something the others didn't. She had already survived tests that most of them couldn't imagine, and she had learned lessons about leadership and courage that couldn't be taught in any classroom. Tomorrow would be the beginning of proving that strength and capability came in many different forms, and that sometimes the most dangerous assumption was thinking you knew what someone was capable of based on how they looked. The showers had been filled with ridicule and dismissal, but they had also revealed the mindset she was working against. What none of them knew yet was that Sarah Mitchell had secrets of her own, experiences that had forged her into something far more formidable than anyone suspected. The question wasn't whether she belonged in this training program. The question was whether they were ready to discover who she really was. Dawn came earlier than most of the recruits expected, with Chief Petty Officer Williams' voice cutting through the barracks like a knife through silence. Sarah was already awake, having learned years ago to wake naturally before any alarm or announcement. She watched as her fellow recruits stumbled from their bunks, some still groggy from the previous night's conversations, and bravado. "Listen up, people," Williams barked. "Today's exercise is designed to test your ability to work as a team under pressure. You'll be divided into groups of 6, and each group will face a series of challenges that require both individual skill and collective problem solving." As the recruits assembled in the main training area, Sarah noticed the way the groups began forming naturally around the most vocal and physically imposing individuals. Marcus Rodriguez was already gathering followers, his confidence from the previous evening carrying over into the morning. Jake Thompson was doing the same, and several other natural leaders were emerging from the group. Sarah found herself standing alone as the informal selection process played out around her. It was a familiar feeling, but not necessarily an uncomfortable one. She had learned to use these moments to observe and assess, gathering information about personalities and dynamics that would prove valuable later. Lieutenant Commander Harrison stepped forward with a clipboard, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been through countless similar exercises. "The groups will be assigned, not chosen," he announced, much to the obvious disappointment of several recruits who had been positioning themselves strategically. "This is about learning to work with anyone, not just the people you're comfortable with." Sarah was assigned to Team Delta, along with Marcus Rodriguez, Jake Thompson, a quiet recruit named David Chun, who had barely spoken since arriving at the facility, a former college wrestler named Tony Vasquez, and a communication specialist named Amy Patterson, who was one of only 3 women in the entire training group. Marcus looked at his assigned teammates with barely concealed frustration. "Great," he muttered under his breath. "This should be interesting." The first challenge was presented as a navigation and obstacle course that required the team to move together through a series of physical and mental tests while carrying a significant amount of equipment. Each team member was assigned specific gear that was essential to completing the overall mission, meaning that individual success was impossible without group coordination. "Your mission," Chief Williams explained, "is to reach the extraction point at the far end of the training area within 90 minutes while completing a series of tasks along the way. You'll encounter obstacles that require different skills and approaches, and your performance will be evaluated both on completion time and on how well you work together." As Team Delta gathered around their assigned equipment, Sarah quietly assessed what they were facing. The gear included communications equipment, medical supplies, navigation tools, rope, and climbing hardware, and several sealed containers that were labeled as essential mission materials, but could not be opened until reaching specific checkpoints. Marcus immediately assumed leadership, which Sarah expected. "All right, everyone," he said, "we need to move fast and stick together. I'll take point and navigate. Jake can handle the communications gear since he's got radio experience, and everyone else can distribute the other equipment based on their strengths." Sarah noticed that he hadn't asked anyone about their actual backgrounds or abilities before making these assignments. She also observed that David Chun had quietly examined the navigation equipment and was studying the terrain map with what looked like considerable expertise, while Amy Patterson was already testing the communications equipment with practiced efficiency. "Actually," Sarah said, speaking up for the first time since the team had been formed, "we might want to assess everyone's actual skills before we decide on roles. This looks like it's going to require some specialized knowledge." Marcus turned to her with an expression of barely controlled impatience. "Look, Sarah, I appreciate that you want to contribute, but we don't have time for a committee discussion. We need to move." Jake Thompson nodded in agreement. "She's right about one thing, though. We should figure out who carries what based on physical capability. No point in overloading people who can't handle the weight." Sarah felt the familiar sting of assumption, but she also recognized an opportunity. "I can carry my share of the equipment," she said calmly, "but I think we should also consider that some of these challenges might not be purely physical." Tony Vasquez, who had been silent up to this point, spoke up. "What kind of non-physical challenges are you thinking about?" Sarah gestured toward the sealed containers they had been given. "Those containers are labeled with technical specifications that suggest they contain materials for specific types of problem solving. The navigation equipment is more sophisticated than what you'd need for basic orienteering. And the medical supplies include items that are used for advanced field procedures, not just basic first aid." Davidson looked up from a map he had been studying. "She's right," he said quietly. "This terrain map shows elevation changes and obstacle types that suggest we're going to encounter some serious technical challenges." Amy Patterson finished her check of the communications equipment and turned to the group. "The radio gear is set up for encrypted communications on multiple frequencies. That's not standard for basic training exercises. Whatever we're going to be doing, it's designed to simulate real operational conditions." Marcus looked around at his teammates with a growing sense that he might have underestimated the complexity of what they were facing. "Okay," he said, his tone becoming more collaborative. "What do you all think our approach should be?" Sarah saw her opening. "I think we should spend 5 minutes having everyone share their actual background and experience. Then we can make informed decisions about roles and responsibilities." Jake Thompson checked his watch. 5 minutes is a lot when we only have 90 minutes total. 5 minutes of planning could save us 30 minutes of confusion later, Sarah replied, especially if we encounter problems that require specific expertise. Marcus nodded reluctantly. All right, let's do it, but keep it brief. Amy Patterson went first, revealing that she had been a communications specialist in the Air Force for 4 years before applying for this training. David Chun, who had barely spoken since arriving, turned out to have been a navigation instructor for mountain rescue operations. Tony Vasquez had experience with both wrestling and rock climbing, making him valuable for any physical obstacles. Jake Thompson's background was exactly what he had implied: radio operator with some tactical training. Marcus had played football and done ROTC, but his actual military experience was limited to basic training. When it came to Sarah's turn, she paused for a moment, knowing that what she said next would either earn their respect or increase their skepticism. I have advanced training in tactical operations, combat medicine, and technical problem solving, she said simply. I've also completed survival training in multiple environments. Marcus frowned. What kind of tactical operations training? The kind that's relevant to what we're likely to face today, Sarah replied, not wanting to elaborate further. Jake Thompson looked skeptical. Where did you get this training? Because most of us here have military backgrounds, and none of us have heard of any programs that would give someone your size that kind of experience. Sarah met his gaze directly. There are programs that most people don't hear about, she said quietly. But I'd rather show you what I can do than spend time talking about credentials. David Chun, who had been listening carefully, spoke up. She's been right about everything she said so far, he pointed out. Maybe we should trust her input and see how it goes. Marcus looked around at his team members, clearly struggling with the dynamics that were emerging. He had expected to lead a group where his physical advantages and natural confidence would make him the obvious choice for leadership. Instead, he was discovering that his teammates had more diverse backgrounds than he had assumed, and that the quiet woman he had dismissed might actually have valuable expertise. All right, he said finally, let's try a different approach. Sarah, what do you think our strategy should be? Sarah felt a moment of satisfaction, but she was careful not to let it show. Based on the equipment we've been given and the terrain map David's been studying, I think we're going to encounter at least 3 types of challenges: navigation through difficult terrain, technical problem solving that requires the SEAL materials, and physical obstacles that need team coordination. She gestured toward the starting point of the course. I suggest we move as a group, but assign specific roles based on expertise. David should handle primary navigation, since he has the most experience. Amy should manage communications. Tony can take point on any climbing or physical obstacles. Marcus and Jake can serve as scouts and back up for whatever challenges we encounter. What about you? Marcus asked. I'll handle tactical assessment and any technical problems we encounter, Sarah replied. And I'll serve as backup medical support if needed. Jake Thompson still looked skeptical. No offense, but tactical assessment sounds like something anyone could do. What makes you more qualified for that than the rest of us? Sarah looked at him steadily. Give me 30 seconds to assess our current situation, and I'll show you. Without waiting for permission, she walked to a slightly elevated position where she could see the entire starting area of the course. She spent a few moments observing, then returned to the group. There are 6 other teams starting this exercise, she said. 3 of them are making the same mistake Marcus almost made, assuming that physical strength and speed are the primary requirements. They're loading their strongest members with the heaviest gear and planning to move fast. She pointed toward one of the other teams. Team Alpha over there has put all their technical equipment with one person, which means if that person gets injured or separated, they lose their ability to complete technical challenges. She gestured toward another group. Team Bravo is spending too much time arguing about leadership instead of assessing the actual requirements. They're going to start late and already be behind schedule. Marcus followed her gaze and realized she was right about all of her observations. How did you see all that so quickly? Training, Sarah replied simply. The same training that tells me this exercise is designed to test our ability to adapt when our initial assumptions prove wrong. The teams that succeed will be the ones that can reassess and change strategy quickly. Tony Vasquez nodded appreciatively. That actually makes a lot of sense. What do you think we should expect from the actual course? Sarah looked at the terrain ahead of them. Based on the equipment we've been given, I think the first challenge will be navigation through terrain that's more difficult than it appears. The second will probably be a technical problem that requires combining materials from multiple sealed containers. The third will be a physical obstacle that requires coordinated teamwork. David Chin looked up from his continued study of the map. There's something else, he said. This route isn't just about getting from point A to point B. There are specific coordinates marked that suggest we need to visit certain locations in a particular order. Amy Patterson had been monitoring the communications equipment and now held up a hand for attention. I'm getting radio chatter that suggests some kind of time-sensitive element to this exercise. It sounds like there might be additional instructions or changes that come during the course, not just at the beginning. Marcus looked around at his team with growing respect. Okay, he said. It sounds like this is going to be more complicated than any of us initially thought. Sarah, you seem to have the best read on the overall situation. What do you think our approach should be? Sarah felt a mixture of satisfaction and caution. She was gaining the team's trust, but she also knew that the real test would come when they encountered actual challenges. Talk was easy. Performance under pressure was what mattered. I think we should move deliberately rather than fast, she said. Take time to assess each challenge properly before acting. Use everyone's expertise instead of relying on assumptions. And be ready to adapt if our initial plan doesn't work. Jake Thompson, who had been the most skeptical, now nodded in agreement. That sounds reasonable. But what happens if you're wrong about what we're going to face? Sarah smiled slightly. The first time her teammates had seen her show any hint of confidence or humor. Then we'll adapt and figure it out together. That's what teams do. As Chief Williams called for all teams to begin the exercise, Team Delta moved forward with a sense of purpose that was noticeably different from their interactions an hour earlier. The ridicule and dismissal that had characterized the previous day's conversations have been replaced by cautious respect and curiosity. What none of them knew yet was that the challenges ahead would reveal not only their individual capabilities, but also the true depth of Sarah Mitchell's background and experience. The assumptions that had shaped their initial impressions were about to be tested in ways that would surprise everyone involved. The first challenge came sooner than expected. Team Delta had been moving through what appeared to be straightforward terrain for about 20 minutes when David Chin suddenly stopped and held up his hand for silence. The map shows a clear path ahead, he said quietly, but my instincts are telling me something's wrong. Sarah immediately moved to his position and examined the terrain ahead of them. What looked like solid ground from a distance showed subtle signs of disturbance that suggested hidden obstacles or unstable surfaces. David's right, she said, pulling out a small device from her equipment pack that the others hadn't noticed before. This area has been modified for the exercise. Those aren't natural terrain features. Marcus looked at the device she was using. What is that thing? Ground penetrating sensor, Sarah replied, reading the display. Standard equipment for detecting hidden obstacles or unstable surfaces. Jake Thompson stared at her. That's not standard equipment for anything I've ever seen. Where did you get that? Sarah looked up from the device. It was in my assigned gear pack. Same as everyone else got specialized equipment based on their listed capabilities. Amy Patterson checked her own equipment pack more carefully and found several pieces of communications gear she hadn't noticed initially. You're right, she said. I've got encrypted satellite communication equipment in here that definitely wasn't part of the basic loadout. Tony Vasquez discovered climbing gear that was far more advanced than what would be needed for simple obstacle navigation. David Chin's navigation equipment turned out to include GPS systems with classified level accuracy. So the question is, Marcus said, looking at Sarah with new understanding, what capabilities did you list that made them give you ground-penetrating sensors? Before Sarah could answer, the device in her hands started beeping rapidly. We need to move now, she said urgently. There's something unstable about this entire area, and it's getting worse. Sarah took point and began leading the team along a route that seemed to make no logical sense based on the visible terrain, but followed the readings from her device. Within minutes, they heard shouting behind them as Team Alpha, which had been following the obvious path, encountered what sounded like a significant obstacle or trap. How did you know? Tony asked as they continued moving. Experience, Sarah replied, but her tone suggested there was much more to the story. As they reached the first checkpoint, they found a sealed container with additional instructions and equipment. Sarah opened it to reveal components for what appeared to be a complex technical device, along with a set of instructions written in military code. Marcus looked at the coded instructions and shook his head. Anyone know how to read this? Sarah was already examining the components and cross-referencing them with the coded instructions. It's a tactical communication device, she said, designed to provide secure coordination between multiple teams in hostile environments. She began assembling the device with practiced efficiency, her movements showing familiarity with the components that went far beyond what any basic training could provide. Jake Thompson watched her work and finally asked the question that all of them were thinking. Sarah, who are you really? Because nobody gets this kind of training and experience without a serious military background, and you're too young to have accumulated this much expertise through normal channels. Sarah paused in her assembly of the device and looked at her teammates. She could see that the trust she had been building with them was reaching a point where her continued evasiveness would actually damage their ability to work together. My background is classified, she said carefully, but I can tell you that I've been training for specialized operations since I was 18 years old. David Chun, who had been studying the terrain ahead while Sarah worked on the device, turned back to the group. Classified how? Like Special Forces classified or something else. Sarah finished assembling the device and tested its functionality before answering. Something else, she said, but right now, what matters is that we complete this exercise successfully. The device she had built immediately began receiving signals from other teams and from the exercise coordinators. The information it provided showed that Team Delta was currently in second place overall, but more importantly, it revealed that the exercise was about to become significantly more challenging. According to this, Sarah said, reading the display, the next phase involved a simulated combat scenario where teams will encounter hostile opposition designed to test their tactical response capabilities. Amy Patterson's communication equipment began receiving similar information through encrypted channels. She's right, Amy confirmed. We're about to face opposition that's designed to eliminate teams that can't handle real operational conditions. Marcus looked at Sarah with growing realization. You knew this was coming, didn't you? That's why you were so concerned about tactical assessment and adapting our strategy. Sarah met his gaze directly. I suspected it based on the equipment we were given and the complexity of the initial challenges. This exercise isn't designed to test basic military readiness. It's designed to identify people who can handle specialized operations. Tony Vasquez asked the question that was becoming increasingly obvious. What kind of specialized operations? Before Sarah could answer, the sound of simulated gunfire erupted from the area where Team Alpha had been traveling. Amy's communication equipment immediately began receiving distress signals and requests for extraction. Team Alpha is down, Amy reported. They're requesting immediate medical support and evacuation. Sarah was already moving, grabbing specific items from her equipment pack that the others hadn't seen before. David, plot the fastest route to their position. Amy, coordinate with exercise control to get medical support moving in their direction. Tony and Marcus were going to need to move fast and potentially under hostile conditions. Jake Thompson stared at her. Wait a minute. Are we supposed to abandon our own exercise to help another team? Sarah looked back at him as she finished checking her equipment. This isn't an exercise anymore. Team Alpha encountered real danger, and there are real injuries. The exercise scenario just became a real rescue operation. She began moving toward Team Alpha's last known position with a speed and efficiency that made it clear she had done this type of thing many times before. Her teammates followed, but it was becoming increasingly obvious that Sarah Mitchell was operating on a completely different level than any of them had imagined. As they moved through terrain that was becoming increasingly challenging, Sarah's tactical awareness and decision-making began to reveal the true depth of her training and experience. She anticipated obstacles before they became visible, identified optimal routes through complex terrain, and coordinated the team's movement with precision that spoke of extensive real-world experience. When they reached Team Alpha's position, they found 3 recruits injured by what turned out to be a malfunctioning obstacle that had created a genuine safety hazard. Sarah immediately took charge of the situation, directing her teammates in providing medical assistance, while simultaneously coordinating with exercise control and incoming medical support. Marcus watched her work and finally understood what he was seeing. "You're not a recruit," he said quietly. "You're an instructor." Sarah looked up from where she was treating an injured recruit's leg injury. "No," she said, "I'm not an instructor." Jake Thompson, who had been helping coordinate communications, overheard the conversation. "Then what are you?" "Because nobody has this kind of training and experience at your age unless they've been doing something very specific for a very long time." Sarah finished stabilizing the injured recruit and stood up as the sound of approaching medical helicopters became audible. "I'm someone who's been doing specialized operations for the past 8 years, she said. "Someone who's been deployed to places and situations that most people never hear about. Someone who volunteered to go through this training program to help identify other people who might be suitable for similar work." Amy Patterson stared at her. 8 years. But you can't be more than 26 years old. "I'm 28, Sarah replied. "And I started specialized training when I was 18, right after high school. I've been serving in classified operations since I was 20. Tony Vasquez was putting the pieces together. Classified operations. Specialized training that starts at 18. Equipment and capabilities that most military personnel never see. He paused. "Your SEAL team." Sarah looked at him for a long moment before nodding. "SEAL Team 6, she said quietly. "I've been serving as a team leader for the past 3 years." The silence that followed this revelation was broken only by the sound of medical helicopters landing nearby. Marcus, Jake, David, Amy, and Tony all stared at the woman they had been ridiculing and underestimating for the past 2 days. Marcus was the first to speak. "Team leader," he said, "in SEAL Team 6. Sarah nodded. "The same SEAL Team 6 that most of you have probably heard about in connection with high-profile operations. The unit that handles the missions that other Special Forces units consider too difficult or too sensitive." Jake Thompson shook his head in amazement. "But why are you here? Why go through recruit training if you're already serving at that level?" Sarah helped coordinate the evacuation of the injured recruits before answering. "Because the nature of modern operations is changing," she said. "We need people who can think differently, approach problems from different angles, and work effectively with diverse teams. I volunteered to go through this program to help identify recruits who have that potential." Amy Patterson looked at her with newfound respect and understanding. "So when we were making assumptions about what you could and couldn't do, you were making the same assumptions that enemies make," Sarah finished. "Assuming that capability is always obvious, that strength always looks a certain way, and that experience always fits a certain profile." David Chun, who had been quiet during most of this conversation, finally spoke up. "Is that why you let us underestimate you at first? To see how we'd react?" Sarah smiled slightly. "Partly, but also because I've learned that it's often more effective to let people reveal their assumptions and biases before showing them a different perspective." As the medical helicopters departed with the injured recruits, Chief Petty Officer Williams approached Team Delta. His expression was serious, but there was also something that might have been pride in his eyes. "Outstanding work," he said to the team. "You responded to an emergency situation with professionalism and effectiveness. You worked together despite having very different backgrounds and initial assumptions about each other." He looked specifically at Sarah. "Commander Mitchell, your performance today demonstrates exactly why this program exists." Marcus's eyes widened. "Commander?" Chief Williams nodded. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, SEAL Team 6. One of the youngest team leaders in the history of the unit, and one of the most decorated female special operations officers currently serving." Jake Thompson looked stunned. "We've been talking to a SEAL Team 6 commander like she was a washout recruit." Sarah looked at her teammates, seeing the mixture of embarrassment, respect, and curiosity in their faces. "The rank doesn't matter right now," she said. "What matters is that you all performed well under pressure when it really counted. You adapted your assumptions, worked together effectively, and prioritized helping people who needed assistance over completing an exercise." Tony Vasquez shook his head in amazement. "I can't believe we spent yesterday making jokes about whether you belonged here." "The jokes and doubts serve a purpose," Sarah replied. "They help me understand how you think, how you react to uncertainty, and what kind of leaders you might become. They also helped you discover that your initial assumptions about people aren't always correct." As they walked back toward the training facility, Sarah's teammates peppered her with questions about her background, her experiences, and what had led her to volunteer for this unusual assignment. "The truth is," she told them, "modern military operations require people who can see past surface appearances, work with diverse teams, and adapt quickly when situations change. Some of the most effective operators I've worked with have been people that others underestimated initially." Marcus looked thoughtful. "So this whole thing was a test?" "Everything in military training is a test," Sarah replied. "But it's not pass or fail. It's about discovering what you're capable of and how you can contribute to something bigger than yourself." As they reached the facility, Sarah turned to face her teammates. "Tomorrow we'll start training scenarios that are designed around the lessons you learned today. About teamwork, about not making assumptions, and about the fact that strength and capability come in many different forms. Jake Thompson looked at her with new respect. "Will you be training with us or training us?" Sarah smiled. "Both," she said, "because the best way to learn is by doing, and the best way to lead is by example." That evening in the mess hall, the dynamic had completely changed. Instead of Sarah sitting alone while others whispered about her, she found herself surrounded by teammates who were eager to learn from her experience and hear her perspectives on the challenges ahead. More importantly, the other recruits in the facility had heard about what had happened during the day's exercise. Word had spread about the woman who had been dismissed and underestimated, but who had turned out to be one of the most experienced and capable operators any of them were likely to encounter. The ridicule and doubt that had characterized the shower conversations were replaced by curiosity and respect. Sarah Mitchell had proven that assumptions about strength, capability, and belonging could be dangerously wrong, and that the most formidable people were often the ones nobody saw coming. As the evening wound down and the recruits prepared for another day of training, Sarah reflected on the lessons that had been learned by everyone involved. Her teammates had discovered that their assumptions about people could blind them to valuable capabilities and perspectives. She had rediscovered why she loved the challenge of helping others reach their potential. Most importantly, everyone had learned that true strength wasn't about size or appearance or meeting conventional expectations. It was about rising to meet challenges, supporting your teammates, and proving through action that you belonged exactly where you were. The showers that had once echoed with ridicule now reflected a different kind of conversation entirely. Sarah Mitchell was no longer the outsider who didn't belong. She was the leader who had shown everyone what belonging really meant.